Just before the long holiday weekend, John Kerry was back in Boston today, but it wasn't for some R&R at his home on Beacon Hill. The Secretary of State was in town briefly to tout the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and he couldn't escape questions about the international crisis on everyone's mind. WGBH News reporter Ron Sanders asked Kerry about balancing his priorities.
Secretary of State Kerry framed his remarks on climate change as a life-and-death battle demanding urgent leadership from the U.S. and the U.K., as in World War II. He and British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond toured a wind technology testing facility in Charlestown and were united in their message to climate change doubters. They asked, what's the worst that can happen if we prepare for climate change? Healthier people, energy independence, and more jobs in a $6 trillion market?
That's the worst that happens to us. What happens if they're wrong? If they're wrong, catastrophe. Life as you know it on Earth ends.
But today, he faced questions about Ebola and confidence in the Centers for Disease Control, a day after life had ended for Thomas Eric Duncan, the first Ebola patient diagnosed in the U.S. What can you say, Mr. Secretary, to comfort Americans about the Ebola outbreak and the trustworthiness of the CDC?
We are confident that we have the ability, with increased input from other countries, which is coming, but not yet quite fast enough, to be able to contain Ebola. The key is being able to isolate people and being able to identify exposure at the earliest moment.
Secretary Kerry says other countries are not spending enough to stop the spread of Ebola. He contrasted the U.S. contribution of almost $114 million to the Ebola response with the $2 to $3 million spent by nations such as China, Japan, Denmark, and Italy. The other major crisis commanding Secretary Kerry's attention, the advance of ISIS militants on Kobani, near Syria's border with Turkey. How significant is it if Kobani falls?
Let me make it very, very clear. Kobani is a tragedy because it represents the evil of ISIS. But it is not the definition either of the strategy or of the full measure of what is happening with respect to ISIL.
Secretary Kerry said Kobani is but one town and that others, Emily, will face conflict with ISIS. In addition to which, he said, after all, we're only a few weeks into building a coalition and we're targeting as a strategy command and control, supply and train centers. And he also says that Ebola happens to be, or appears to be, at least as equally a pressing matter as these other crises internationally.
Well, unfortunately, as soon as something enters American soil, that becomes the #1 crisis. I mean, he didn't inspire a lot of confidence, in me anyway, when he was talking about the CDC response. Did he even address the whole thing about taking people's temperatures? I mean,
well, he said that precautions have been taken to isolate people who came in contact with Mr. Duncan. And he was quite emphatic. Rhetorically, I would say he used words such as confidence strongly. He said, I feel very strongly that, and I'm really confident in our screening ability. He mentioned that screening in airports will be increased. He also says we're asking foreign ministers in nations such as China to help out. You saw that he says they're not spending enough and they need help with medevac capacity as well as health workers and treatment units.
All right, Ron Sanders, thanks for that. So to what lengths should our government go and others go to stop Ebola from spreading further? Here to discuss that is George Ennis. He's chair of the Department of Health, Law, Bioethics, and Human Rights at Boston University's School of Public Health. Welcome to Greater Boston.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
George, your opinion has been sought on this issue for several months now, well before there was any imminent danger in the United States. But what you said back in August was that the United States need to have some plan in place to ID the virus should it come here. Is that in place?
It seems to be in place now. Whether it was in place before the Dallas case is arguable. But certainly that was a wake-up call to all the hospitals that hadn't had a good response in their emergency departments, and I think it's highly unlikely that would be repeated again.
The plan to take temperatures, I mean, I couldn't help but having skeptical would be a mild way of putting it. You know, I wanted to guffaw, actually. I mean, taking people's, you got some person run around who's probably not a medical person, doing something, putting it up to your forehead. They're not allowed to touch you. It's like, what? That's the best we can do?
Well, that's unlikely to be very effective.
Yeah.
And even, you know, the CDC Commissioner Tom Frieden said that he was against doing that. And
who's for this?
Well, somebody above him, obviously.
In all honesty,
I mean, I think everybody thinks that if you're going to screen people, you want to screen them before they get on the plane, not after they get here. That's exactly correct.
Well, what would be effective?
Well, I mean, taking temperature should.
But there, before here.
Yeah.
By a medical person before you get on an airplane.
Well, at least with technology that works, yeah, that's right. Before you get on an airplane, and you know, at least some history of knowing whether you have been in contact. Now, you should know better than to fly if you've been in contact with
unless you want to get out of the country,
Ebola.
Because people would want to come here thinking that their chances of survival would be better.
Well, at least some people probably would, if they're sick. But now, if they're sick, they wouldn't know they're sick unless they had symptoms. And if they had symptoms, they certainly shouldn't be permitted to get on a plane.
We've talked about this, and I've heard you say a little bit about, you know, the concerns that it's who do you treat, how do you treat them, and is there favoritism? I mean, there was this drug that was dispensed when 2 American health workers came down with the disease a month ago, and it was an experimental drug, hadn't been used on humans. But I mean, that wasn't necessarily a good thing. But how should it be determined who gets what?
Well, I think it should be first come, first served basis. On the other hand, everybody should know that we don't have anything right now. We have some things that we're starting to do research on. That's it. And the people who got ZMapp, for example, that looked like it might work, but it had never been used in humans before. The thought was it probably was safe and maybe it could help. Now, if you're dying and have Ebola, you probably take that chance, but it should totally be your call. I mean, I'm sure other people might say, no, I don't want any experimental stuff.
We had some Bostonian Liberians on last night who were saying that that country was very slow to believe in the epidemic because there's a lot of skepticism about government. There's, you know, perpetration of hoaxes, financial issues, and they had just come off a long civil war. I mean, whose duty is it to kind of spread the word? I mean, not that they would necessarily believe a Western country either, but how do you make something like this more real?
Well, it's obviously very difficult. I mean, you can see why they'd like to deny it. I mean, it's a horrible disease, and it's going to take whole turnover in the country to face this. So I think number one is the country's leadership is the first thing. The so-called international community. Well, we're learning there. That hardly exists. That's very fragile. I mean, we'd expect the World Health Organization to take a leadership role. They actually, and Doctors Without Borders, which is doing, I think, the best job there, has been historically doing the best job there, almost begged the World Health Organization, please take over, but coordinate. We can't handle this. We're a non-governmental organization. Well, they said they don't have the staff or the mission. They can't, or the money, any of those things. They couldn't. So now then our president, Obama, said, well, the U.S. will take the leadership. And that's absolutely right, but that doesn't happen overnight either. Now you saw a graphic. Hardly any other countries are stepping up anywhere near the way we are. So.
They won't.
Yeah.
All right. George Annis, it's always a pleasure to have you here.
Okay, pleasure to be here.